I leaned back on my porch, stretching my legs over the railing as the sun melted into the horizon, the quiet hum of crickets mixed with the distant mooing of my cattle. This was my slice of heaven. 5 acres of rolling green, a red barn in the back, and a wraparound porch big enough to fit half the town on a summer night. That's when I heard the distinct crunch of tires on gravel. A white Lexus rolled up my driveway, slow and deliberate, like a predator sizing up its prey. My peace was about to be disturbed. The door popped open, and out stepped Martha Delacroix. Mid-50s, blonde bob shellacked into place, wearing a blazer like she was about to address the United Nations instead of a rural HOA meeting. She carried a clipboard, always a bad sign. "Good evening, Sheriff Langley," she said, voice dripping with saccharine pleasantries. "I hope I'm not intruding." "You're standing in my driveway, clipboard in hand," I said, setting down my beer. "So, I'll assume this isn't a social call." Martha's smile twitched. "We have some concerns about your property. Here we go." I pushed off the porch and walked toward her. "We?" She gestured vaguely at the neighborhood beyond my fields. "The Homeowners Association. We've received multiple complaints about, well, violations." "Violations?" I repeated. "This is a farm." "Martha, not a gated community?" She held up her clipboard, flipping through papers like she was reading from the Constitution. "Your barn is not within HOA-approved color parameters. It must be repainted within 30 days. I blinked. "The barn? The barn that's been red since before I was born?" She ignored me. "Additionally, we've received reports of excessive animal noise. Livestock must adhere to noise ordinance levels between the hours of—" I laughed, which only made her lips press tighter. "Martha, it's a farm. Cows moo, chickens cluck. You move next to me, not the other way around." She cleared her throat. "And finally, we have serious concerns about your roadside produce stand. Selling without proper permits is a direct violation." I held up a hand. "All right, let's stop right there. My farm stand is on my property. It's been running for 10 years. I have all the paperwork I need." She cocked her head like a bird sizing up a worm. "Well, I'd advise you to double-check. Because if you can't meet HOA regulations, we may have no choice but to escalate this matter." I crossed my arms. "Escalate how?" Martha's smile returned, just a little too wide. "You'll see." And with that, she turned on her heel, climbed into her Lexus, and drove away. I chuckled, shaking my head. I'd been sheriff of this town for 15 years. I'd seen my share of petty disputes, but this was new. I figured it'd blow over. I was wrong. The next morning, I found a notice of violation nailed to my fence. I plucked it off, scanning the list of infractions. Unauthorized structure. Barn is not an HOA-approved color. Unregulated commercial. Sales. Farm stand operating without proper clearance. Noise disturbance. Livestock exceed acceptable decibel levels. At the bottom, in perfectly neat cursive, failure to comply will result in further action. I let out a low whistle. She wasn't wasting any time. By the end of the week, she'd sent HOA inspectors to my property. They strutted around with their clipboards, taking notes on God knows what, trying to find something, anything that would stick. But here's the thing about being sheriff. I know the law. I stood there, arms crossed, watching them flounder. "Anything illegal?" I asked, more amused than concerned. One of them, a balding guy in khakis, shook his head. "No. Everything seems up to code." Martha, standing nearby, went rigid. "Look again." The inspector sighed and flipped through his notes. "The barn is within agricultural property guidelines. The produce stand is legal under state exemptions. And as for the livestock, well, farms have animals. That's not a violation." I grinned. Imagine that. Martha's jaw clenched so tight. Thought her teeth might shatter. She wasn't expecting this. She thought she'd waltz in, throw around some HOA nonsense, and I'd roll over. But I wasn't just a farmer. I was the law around here. That should have been the end of it. But Martha wasn't the type to back down. The next week, I started getting anonymous complaints to the county board, health department visits, zoning, Inspections. Even the fire marshal showed up one morning, scratching his head at why he'd been called. It was laughable at first. A mild inconvenience. Then my insurance rates mysteriously skyrocketed. My farm's permit renewal got delayed for the first time in a decade. And then, one afternoon, I walked out to my roadside stand and found "closed by order of the HOA" plastered across it. In big red letters, Martha wasn't just trying to harass me, she was trying to shut me down. I went straight to her house. She answered the door with a smirk, like she'd been expecting me. "Langley," she cooed. "What a surprise." "You've made your point," I said. "Whatever this is, drop it." Her smile widened. "Oh, Sheriff, I'm simply ensuring the neighborhood stays within its best interests." I took a step closer. "You're going too far, Martha." She didn't blink. "You haven't even seen too far yet." Something about the way she said it sent a slow, crawling unease through me. This wasn't about the farm. This was about something bigger, and Martha Delacroix was just getting started. I spent the next week playing defense. The anonymous complaints kept coming. The county sent another inspector, this time to assess the environmental impact of my farm. Then came a surprise visit from the tax assessor's office, conveniently questioning my land's agricultural exemption. Martha was throwing everything. She had at me, hoping something would stick. But she wasn't just after me. I started hearing whispers from my neighbors. Small things at first. How their property values were mysteriously under review. How their HOA fees had suddenly spiked. How longtime residents were receiving letters about compliance concerns. I knew a shakedown when I saw one, and I was starting to think Martha wasn't acting alone. The final straw came on a crisp Saturday morning. I stepped outside, coffee in hand, expecting the usual peaceful start to my day. Instead, I found a bulldozer, idling on the edge of my property. Martha stood beside it, arms folded, sunglasses reflecting the early sunlight. A smug little smile played on her lips. Behind her, two men in neon vests loitered, pretending not to look guilty. I set down my mug. "Martha." "Sheriff Langley," she said smoothly. "Beautiful morning, isn't it?" I nodded toward the bulldozer. "Something I should know about?" "Oh, just some mandatory infrastructure work, you understand. Safety regulations." "On my land?" She pulled a neatly folded paper from her purse and handed it over. "According to revised zoning maps, this strip right here, it's part of the neighborhood's common area now." I scanned the document. Sure enough, some bureaucratic nonsense about easements and adjustments had magically reclassified a portion of my property. I let out a slow breath. "And you think you're just going to take it?" Martha smiled. "Not take, improve. We're installing a lovely new walking path, a beautiful addition to the community." "You're bulldozing my fence," I said flatly. "Well," she sighed, "your fence was in violation anyway." I folded the paper and slid it into my pocket. "I'd suggest you tell your crew to pack it up." Her expression didn't change. "I don't think so." I smiled. "You do realize you're talking to the sheriff, right?" Martha took a step closer, lowering her voice. "And you do realize that I've had every department in this county sniffing around your farm for weeks?" She let that sink in. I stared. At her. At the way she knew she was untouchable. She wasn't just some busybody with a clipboard. Martha Delacroix had power, and she was using it to crush me. "You think you're above the law?" I said. She smiled. "No, Sheriff. I think I am the law." She turned to the crew. "Proceed." The engine revved. I pulled out my phone. "This is private property," I called over the noise. "You take one step onto it, and I'll have you arrested for trespassing." The driver hesitated. Martha's expression darkened. "Don't be ridiculous." I didn't move. "Try me." A long, tense silence. Then, "Shut it down," one of the workers muttered. "I'm not getting arrested over this." Martha whirled on them. "You're quitting? Over him?" The man shrugged. "Lady, I don't know what kind of war you're fighting, but I ain't getting in the middle of it." The bulldozer's engine died. Martha's face turned an unnatural shade of red. "You'll regret this," she hissed, jabbing a finger at me. I just smiled. "See you at the next HOA meeting," she stormed off. I should have felt like I'd won. Instead, I had the sinking feeling this was far from over. That night, I did some digging. I called in a few favors at the county records office, asking for anything on recent rezoning changes and HOA-related disputes, and that's when I found it. Buried under layers of legal jargon and obscure paperwork was a proposal for a real estate development project, right in the middle of our neighborhood. Project backed by Northcrest Holdings, a private investment firm, and who just so happened to be their local representative, Martha Delacroix. It all clicked. She wasn't on some crusade for neighborhood purity. She was trying to tank property values. If she could make life miserable enough, push out enough residents, Northcrest Holdings could buy up the land for pennies on the dollar. And my farm? It was in the way. I leaned back in my chair, tapping the papers against my desk. Martha had been playing a long game, but she'd just made a mistake. She thought she could intimidate me. She thought I was just some stubborn old farmer clinging to his land. She didn't realize I was building a case. 2 days later, Martha escalated. I woke up to cease and desist orders taped all over my property. Then, an official letter from an attorney, some big-shot law firm, threatening legal action over continued violations. And then, the kicker, a notice for a mandatory HOA board hearing to determine whether my farm should be permanently shut down. Martha had just thrown everything she had at me. But what she didn't know, I had everything I needed to take her down. Showed up at that hearing prepared. I had documents, emails, proof of her involvement with Northcrest Holdings, but I wasn't going to just reveal it all at once. No, I was going to let her dig her own grave first. The meeting was packed. Residents, HOA board members, even a few reporters. Martha sat at the head of the table, flanked by her loyal lackeys, radiating confidence. She thought she'd already won. "Sheriff Langley," she began, "we're here today to discuss your continued violations and the necessary actions to protect our community." I leaned back in my chair. "Oh, I'm all for protecting the community." She smiled, oblivious. "Then I assume you'll cooperate." I smirked. "Depends." Martha arched a brow. "On what?" I slid a folder onto the table. "On whether you'd like to explain this to everyone first." She hesitated. Then, finally, she opened it. Her face went pale. She knew. She knew she was screwed. But she still didn't know how badly. Not yet. Martha's fingers twitched as she flipped through the folder. The color drained from her face. Her eyes flicked to me, searching for some kind of bluff. There wasn't one. I watched the exact moment realization dawned. The slow, creeping horror of someone who just discovered the walls were already closing in. The room was silent. Every single HOA board member was staring. The residents, the ones who had come expecting to see me get railroaded, were leaning forward. In their seats, I let the silence stretch, let her squirm. Then I leaned in, tapping the folder. "You recognize this, don't you, Martha?" She swallowed. I smirked. "Go on, read it aloud for the room." She didn't. So I did. Proposal for large-scale residential development. In Northcrest Valley Strategic Acquisition Plan to secure community assets at below market value. A murmur rippled through the audience. I turned the page. Prepared and submitted by Martha Delacroix, Regional Development Liaison. The murmur turned into a low roar. I held up another document. Emails, signed letters, financial agreements tying Martha directly to Northcrest Holdings. Turns out, while Martha's been running around fining people over mailbox colors, she's also been working with private investors to lower property values in the neighborhood. Gasps. Someone cursed under their breath. I wasn't done. You ever wonder why the HOA fees jumped? Why people got hit with sudden violations? Why longtime residents were suddenly being harassed? I turned to the crowd. She wasn't protecting the community. She was selling it. Martha shot to her feet. "This is a blatant misrepresentation. You have what, Martha?" I said, standing too. "An explanation for why your name is all over these deals? For why your violations only ever targeted the homes that weren't likely to sell to your developer buddies?" She opened her mouth, but no words came out. I could feel the energy in the room shift. The crowd, her crowd, wasn't hers anymore. I smiled. What was the plan exactly? Drive me out? Shut down the farm? Depress property values just enough that Northcrest Holdings could swoop in and buy everything up for a fraction of what it's worth? The HOA board members looked sick. One of them, a gray-haired man in a suit, turned to her, voice like gravel. Is this true? Martha laughed, a brittle, desperate sound. Oh, please. You're seriously going to believe him over me? She gestured wildly. This is a fabrication, a smear campaign. I slid one last piece of paper in front of her. This is your signed contract with Northcrest Holdings, I said. Your own signature, right there at the bottom. She froze. Checkmate. The room exploded. Residents shouting, board members demanding explanations, people grabbing their own HOA paperwork, muttering about lawsuits. The press was eating it up, cameras flashing, phones recording. And Martha? She was crumbling. This is all... You can't prove... I leaned in close, just loud enough for her to hear. I already did. Her mouth snapped shut. She looked around, wild-eyed, as if searching for anyone to back her up. But the people who once feared her? The people who went along with her just to avoid being the next target? They weren't afraid anymore, because they'd seen her lose. A board member cleared his throat. Effective immediately, Martha Delacroix is removed from the HOA and all governing positions. Another one added, We'll be turning this over to the county attorney, and that's when Martha knew she was finished. She tried to hold on to her composure, but I saw it. The moment her face cracked, the trembling lip, the tightening shoulders, the rage bubbling beneath the surface. She gathered her things too fast. This isn't over, she hissed under her breath. You think you've won? I chuckled. I know I have. She stormed out, slamming the door behind her, and just like that, Martha Delacroix's reign of terror was over. The fallout was swift. Within a week, Northcrest Holdings pulled out of their shady deal. No profit to be made with Martha out of the picture. Her connections dried up. Her power vanished overnight. Lawsuits started rolling in, residents demanding refunds on fines, legal threats about property harassment. And Martha? Well, let's just say her name wasn't welcome in this town anymore. I heard she packed up and left, just like that, like she'd never been here at all. A month later, we threw a barbecue at the farm. Everyone came, neighbors, shop owners, folks who'd been living under her thumb for years. There was music, grilled steaks, and a keg that ran dry twice. And best of all, no Martha. I stood on my porch, watching the laughter, the chatter, the sense of relief in the air. The farm was safe. The town was free. I felt someone step beside me, Old Man Porter, one of the board members. He took a slow sip of his beer, gazing out at the crowd. Hell of a thing you did, he said. I smirked. Hell of a thing she tried, he chuckled. You think she'll try coming back? I glanced out at the bonfire, at the neighborhood that had learned to stand up for itself. No, I said. She knows better. And even if she didn't, we'd never let someone like her get a foothold again. I clinked my bottle against his and took a sip. Somewhere in the crowd, someone cranked the music louder. Martha was gone. The town was ours again. And damn, did that barbecue taste like victory.